January 28th. And we also are going to be taking applications for our mentor program starting on October 16th through November 15th. Entrepreneurs in the room, please don't wait till November 15th, even though you always do. This program actually matches entrepreneurs with up to 3 mentors to help them work through what challenges they have in starting their companies. I highly recommend it. And with that, I'm just going to end right there and introduce Tom Saras, tonight's moderator.
Great. Thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you, Keegan, and thank you, the Enterprise Forum here, for bringing us all together. Appreciate that a lot. So tonight's panel is the most startup-minded tech and data-driven campaign ever. I sort of was thinking a little bit about this, and we had this really great prep call, and it kind of dawned on me. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. That after this conversation, we basically, at least I came to this idea that political campaigns have finally moved into Series B financing, which I thought was kind of an interesting idea. So the rhetorical question for the evening will probably be, who's going to be the WeWork of 2020, right? So a little bit about myself. I built a company called Rally in 2008. It was originally called Pyrex. Over the span of about 10 years, we ended up powering about 70,000 political campaigns and moving about $4 or $5 billion through our platform. So we saw a lot of activity on both sides of the aisle. Everyone from Mitt Romney's presidential campaign to Elizabeth Warren, who's now a presidential candidate. And so I spent about a decade there, and now today I spend most of my time hanging out and doing crypto and blockchain stuff. So some of the questions I hope be a little bit directed towards advances in technology since my time in politics, and maybe some that are political entrepreneur oriented. But the first question that I'm going to ask everyone, after of course they introduce themselves, please, is if it came down to a theoretical matchup between Coke and Pepsi, who would win? Let's start with you.
Sure. I'm David Shor. I'm in charge of the R&D for the political wing of Civis Analytics. And I'd say Coke their support is very badly distributed. It's over-concentrated in the South, so probably in a 50-50 Pepsi's favor.
Oh, that's a good way to think about it.
I'm Mike Shields. I'm a partner at a firm called Convergence Media. I was the Republican National Committee Chief of Staff in 2013 and 2014 when we began to utilize the Growth and Opportunity Report to build out our data and digital infrastructure. And who would win between Coke and Pepsi? This will be a theme. My first way to answer that question is I would turn to Ellen and ask what the analytics scores tell us on those before I made a gut.
Leadership training right here, guys.
Excellent. Hi, I'm John Hagner. I am a partner at a company called Clarity Campaign Labs. We do analytics and custom polling for Democratic and progressive clients. Before Clarity, I worked at the Democratic National Committee, Democratic Senatorial Committee, Democratic Congressional Campaign, all the alphabet soup. And I would say that the winner would definitely be Coke, because I assume the Koch brothers would come in heavy, super PAC, blow people up, go negative, do everything they need to do to win.
I think they would go negative.
My name is Ellen Bredenkoetter. I'm the Chief Data Officer at the Republican National Committee. Prior to this, I was at Data Trust. I did Walker's presidential campaign, Romney's presidential campaign, was at the NRCC, so sort of the alphabet soup counterpart on the Republican side in the data space. I would have to go with Pepsi. I'm going to be the voice of dissent here. It just has a much larger portfolio of diverse brands compared to Coke. You know, you've got a lot of snacks that I really enjoy.
Their bottles are a little cooler too.
Right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Well, so part of the reason I brought that up is in 2018, Coca-Cola spent, I think, $6 billion on global advertising, right? They're one of the largest advertisers in the world. And in I was reading an article, and it said that in June of 2019, it's estimated that there's going to be $10 billion spent on political advertising this year. Larger, almost, dare say, twice as large as Coca-Cola's entire advertising budget, right? This is the company that wanted to put their logo on the moon, right? This is pretty incredible. So what does that really mean, right? It means that political campaigns have to raise and spend $10 billion over the span of about a year, which, you know, if you've ever run a company, right, entrepreneurs in the room, spending money, I think, is equally as hard as raising money. So one of the questions that I have for the panelists here is, how are you or your clients preparing their operations for a massive influx of cash, unprecedented in history, right? And, you know, just like any startup having to deal with venture financing, you know, what are you doing to kind of keep yourselves from becoming the WeWork of 2020? So I'm going to start with Mike, then John, Ellen, and David.
What are campaigns doing to prepare themselves to spend their money?
Yeah.
Look, I think one of the revolutions that has finally taken hold in our party, as we have caught up to the Democrats, is that the utilization of data and analytics has become a central part of campaigns, and so and from that, an extension of that, digital advertising rather than just television all the time, and that allows for a much more refined, sophisticated, and efficient spending of dollars based upon the audiences that you're trying to reach, and so it provides a much more scalable voter contact program than we had before. So I think what's underway is that every campaign now, from local county council all the way up to the president of the United States, whose campaign is run by a digital marketer, are utilizing analytics, finding ways to have efficiencies, finding ways to be more accurate with what they're doing, and not only sort of having that down the hall and someone reporting them, but bring it to the central decision-making part of their campaigns, so that all their budget decisions start with those data and analytics. And so that's how I would say they're preparing to spend their money. And because it's scalable, they're able to look at all kinds of different scenarios for how their money is going to be spent based on a series of different dynamics, which isn't really allowed for in previous sort of big television budget campaigns, because you either have enough money to get on broadcast television in some markets or you don't. And if you don't, then your campaign looks like this. And if you do, your campaign looks like that. And that's not the case anymore. And so they're able to be much more flexible and nimble than they were before.
Yeah, and I remember, like, if you look back in older years, the digital team was always kind of stuck in the back corner, battling TV for any amount of budget that they could get and always having to prove it. It sounds like that's changed a bit.
Well, what's amazing is that for years we had digital marketers who were working on campaigns, and very smart folks like the people on this panel, much smarter than I am at data and digital marketing, who wanted to be have a seat at the table to run a campaign as opposed to being told to go down the hall. And President Trump is the first sort of big campaign that has allowed a digital marketer to actually run the entire operation, to the point where at one point Brad had said that he may not even have named a digital department in the Trump campaign, because the entire Trump campaign is a massive digital department from which are extensions all the other elements of marketing. Wow. And and he was a private sector marketer, wasn't involved in politics before. So that is like the culmination of this revolution, is that you have the president's campaign having someone at the not at the seat of the table, but the head of the table running that.
John, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think for Democrats, it's a little bit more of a challenge because we don't know who we're spending money in service of, and frankly, we may not until the Milwaukee convention is in July. So hopefully we know before then, but I wouldn't bet my fortune on it. So I think that we're in it's sort of an odd space of testing various scenarios, getting ready, but building a political campaign is like building a startup, but you have, instead of a year, you've got a week. And you're building $1 billion corporation knowing that it's going to collapse, knowing it's going to end. I think one of the things we're trying to help our clients get much smarter about as we get into the later half of 2020, there'll be more money than good places to spend it. And we aren't going to have control over where those places go, right? The conservative Supreme Court deciding that speech is money and money is speech means that we can't control lots of the super PAC operations. So there could be some really unhelpful things. And one of the things we've done a lot of research on, I think it's easy for folks who've been doing this for a long time to assume if you spend money, the two things that could happen are it's going to be ignored or it's going to help. And there's an increasing body of evidence that a lot of what we do actually has a backlash effect, that because, to your Coke and Pepsi analogy, it's not about spending, Coke cares that they make more money than they did yesterday. They don't necessarily care about beating Pepsi on one specific day, at one specific moment. But we do, and we're in this, we win and they lose, or they win and we lose. And there's backlash that is built into so much of what we talk about, and we're really bad at detecting that. And so I think one of the things we're trying to do now in this sort of weird interregnum of what are we going to do is helping people understand the techniques of testing what they want to do, get a smart way to test it first so we can make sure that at least it does no harm. Maybe it's not going to help anything, but it doesn't cost us anything.
Yeah, and that's actually really even harder for the Democratic side of the aisle because you have multiple candidates battling it out, distributing cash across a very large field, whereas the Republicans are like, hey, we've got 4 years of cash and fundraising operations, and we're just waiting, right?
Yeah.
I think I saw a number was like Trump brought in $125 million relative to $25 million for Elizabeth Warren, and right. So it's like, and then all of a sudden, fundraising's like logarithmic.
Right.
You raise all of it right after July.
And the money that we have now is being spent in very weird and not super helpful ways, right? My first campaign was Howard Dean when he ran for president in 2003, when I was young and innocent. And we thought it was, we spent $100 per caucus goer in Iowa when you looked at the budget, and I was like, this is the worst. These old white people get so much. And then, $100 per caucus goer would be a deal of a lifetime, right? We're going to end up as a party spending about $14,000 per caucus goer in Iowa by the time we're all said and done. Like, we are the economy of Iowa this year. And hopefully they remember that in November. They have not recently, and we are not happy about it. But it's not how you would choose to spend the party's resources, but that's what's going to happen. So,
well, Ellen, what do you think?
Yeah, one of the things you just said, we're just kind of waiting around. Not to contradict you there, but I think one of the things that we're very focused on, and one of the things that came out of, to Mike's point about the growth and opportunity report earlier, is that we need to invest earlier. There used to be this school of campaigns where you just stockpiled cash and you threw it all on broadcast TV at the end. You didn't invest in data and analytics. You didn't invest in a ground game. And I think, I'll give the Democrats credit here. I think, President Obama really shook up that playbook. He invested heavily in a field and organizing operation, and we own this. We basically just copied it. We improved it. But we've really, at the RNC, made a big effort to build out a sprawling, massive field infrastructure to support not only the president, but also candidates up and down the ballot, from state senate to city council. I mean, we're currently running data on Michigan municipal races right now. And so we're really trying to shake up the playbook and invest earlier in field operations, in data. The other thing I would say, one thing I don't think gets enough attention on the money side of politics is the data that actually goes into raising the money. Because one of the struggles I think in politics is if you're Coke, you have a constant feedback loop. Are people buying Coca-Cola? Are they buying Diet Coke? Are we selling more than Pepsi at this store? In politics, you have one day every 2 years where you get to see if you were right or wrong. But for fundraising, every single day you have a constant feedback loop. You can test different messages, you can test different modes of delivery, you can test different advertising, and that's something that I think on the Republican side, we've done. We raised $125 million last quarter.
That's pretty incredible, actually.
It really is,
especially in primary season.
Especially when you consider that fundraising tends to ramp up. If we did $125 million in Q3 of 2019, can you imagine what we'll do in Q3 of 2020?
When we used to sit back and we would literally watch the data. We could see all these campaigns raising money, and then next thing you know, the nominee was selected, but maybe not actually nominated officially yet, and their fundraising just went bonkers. It was unreal how much money that they were raising after that. I mean, that's pretty impressive. I mean, the RNC has done actually a pretty good job investing, I think, in
They really have.
whether it's like data trust and some of these different things to kind of build out that infrastructure.
Yep.
Similar to how the Obama campaign spent a lot of time investing in all that kind of stuff as well.
We've been very lucky. I mean, from the president naming literally a digital marketer, Brad, who is as data-driven of a campaign manager as you could ever ask for, to Chairman McDaniel, who is so invested in this stuff, to Chairman Priebus before her, who really kicked it off and just invested so heavily. So we've been very lucky on the Republican side there.
And David, you were on the Obama campaign, right? You guys did a lot of investment into tech and analytics and things like that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that things have changed a lot even since 2012. I would say Obama shook things up by starting his campaign, hiring analytics folks, maybe having, at this point in the cycle, 5 or 6 people. That was considered like incredible. At this point, even just at our firm, we have 40 people working on politics right now, and that's a year out. So, a lot of it is just that the complexity of running a campaign has gotten a lot harder. It's not enough to just print out a bunch of lists and have people knock on doors. You have to now have this very complex ad operation across Facebook and YouTube and build ad tech and solve like very hard attribution problems. It takes a very long time.
You bring back very painful memories of sitting in a room preparing to go doing block walking efforts.
That's how I got started. I did that for 10 years, and
Oh gosh.
it's nice to have, it'd be October, and I don't have blisters from
That's
from
right.
cancer.
And then calling dead people,
Yeah.
right? So on our prep call here, you guys, we've had a few moments here where you've talked about how basically everything is funded, right? And this is something that I felt like was...
If you're on the D-Trip email list, don't ignore that.
Right.
You have to keep it.
But, there's a lot of cash coming in and things are being funded really well. I would love to know what kinds of GOTV and fundraising experiments are most interesting right now or that you've seen, and what strategies are you implementing to best prioritize experiments? Because if you can do everything, well, how do you prioritize them? David?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say on the progressive side, there's a giant ecosystem. There's a lot of startup incubators. There's a bunch of people going out and doing a bunch of different experiments. But I'd also say that even though everything's going to be funded, probably the biggest lesson for us has been that a lot of the stuff people associate with traditional campaign work and with traditional analytics, knocking on doors, like putting ads in the right TV slot, isn't actually what wins elections. Like, I don't think anyone woke up after 2016 and went, Hillary Clinton, didn't win because she didn't knock on enough doors or spend enough ads. And so kind of for us, the big thing, at least at our firm, has been trying to move beyond this framework of our job is to help people raise money or, buy ads or sort walk lists and try to actually move up the value chain and make higher value decisions.
Ellen, how are you guys?
Yeah, I think
What was interesting? I mean, you guys have done a lot of experimentation.
we have. The Republican side really, after 2012, really made an effort to start doing more experiments. And so, every quarter there's a group of data firms and data interested folks, pollsters, TV guys, everyone who get together and present various experiments. I think, for me, the limiting factor on experiments, and I don't mean fundraising experiments here, but actual how do you move voters experiments is, to go back to the Coke and Pepsi analogy, you only have so many election days. And so it's really, really challenging. Like, in a corporate environment, you can test, you can remove variables, you can have a true control group. But with the number of groups and things going on in any major election, it's really difficult to do that. And so for us, I think the limiting factor with experiments is just the way politics works. It's a lot harder to do a true experiment in political campaigns than it is in the corporate space.
Yeah, it's like trying to, certainly the conditions are different during a real battleground effort relative to the standard daily operations of a party.
Exactly, and the type of voters who engage are different, and so it's just, it's a challenge, and that's something we have to deal with constantly, and that we always want to work to move the ball forward on.
Yeah. We have been working on the Democratic side since about 2004. There's an organization called the Analyst Group and the Analyst Institute that is devoted to doing rigorous research on campaigns, and it's a culture problem getting folks to adapt this. And we finally, having worked on it since 2004, are getting to a point where people don't look at you like you're crazy for saying you want a control group. And it's as simple an idea as like, all right, well, you might want to talk to 200,000 people, but you only have enough money to talk to 150,000 people. So instead of picking that at random, let's intentionally randomize it, right? And let's set aside a control group so that we can see what happens. But you know, the first 10 years you tried to get someone to convince it was a good idea, they're like, no, you've got to leave, get out of here, like who let you in? So it's been really helpful.
And I remember when I was trying to convince candidates to pay me $50 to help them, build a website. They're like, you're crazy.
What is wrong with you?
Who needs them?
Really, that's just it's a culture. But I think what we're moving toward is, a lot of our experiments over the last decade or so have been, the question is who, right? Who should we be talking to? And I think, in a world where we're not funded yet, and I don't want anyone to say that but I think we will get there. It's more of a question of, all right, what do we say to these folks when we get them, right? It's not, you should talk to David Shor, it's you should talk to David Shor about X, Y, or Z. And if you start a conversation, you think you should talk to him about choice, and he says, I don't want to talk about choice, I want to talk to the environment, great, you switch tracks. But to have a place that you think is the right spot to start that conversation, I think that's what a lot of our experimentation is turning to.
And how do you handle it? Because I remember when Romney finally became the nominee the first time, and like literally everyone's hair was on fire. There was just like explosions, like, okay, nominee, we have to set up this massive operation, we got to hire 1,000 people, and we have to prioritize experiments. Like, how are you guys going to do that? Like, that's difficult. That's really hard.
Yeah, it is really hard. I think part of it is that we've been at every presidential campaign in the primary. There are folks that are members of the analyst group that have been thinking about this for a while. That we're not starting from scratch with people, and that's a testament. There's 1,000 people who are members. They work hard. We've started to dig this into the culture of how we work, and I'm sure it's true on the Republican side. The Democratic side, there's a ton of collaboration. David and I's companies compete with each other, but we're friends and we share things where we can. We wake up every day because we're trying to win these elections, and if we can have a successful company that does that, all the better. But I think that helps on the culture piece of we're trying to get out here. That we're going to share the information we have. So the primary could get rough, but people can take a week off, rub some dirt on it, and then we'll get back together because there's something more at stake. And I think we'll be able to prioritize that because we spent a long time getting that ready.
How do you blitz scale?
Yeah, look, you mentioned something that's an important historical reference point for what we were able to do. Romney coming into the RNC as the nominee in 2012 and having the cupboard bare and having to go up against the first $1 billion presidential campaign and incumbent president who, you would know better than me, it looks like they spent over $300 million of that billion just on their data team. Was a daunting task. They performed miracles in the 6 months that you guys had for that. But when I came in immediately after that, the point was this could never happen again. We have to have a party structure that is strong enough to have a culture change so that it is strong enough to do experiments, so that when we do have a nominee, they're walking into an infrastructure that's already built, not, as Ellen said, hoarded cash to the end and just waited to explode on television.
How do you logistically organize that stuff? Because that's hard to do in between cycles.
Well, so a culture change is dramatic and difficult, and what we had to do was ask ourselves some really hard fundamental questions, things like, why are we here? Why do we have parties? What is a party committee for? And we fundamentally reshaped what a party committee does. And that's always painful. You're talking about how you guys sort of get along in your consultant community in your party. I don't necessarily see that as much in ours. I think that we've been able to construct an ecosystem based upon incentives that everyone has brought together in a market-driven incentive-based system.
That is a good way to put it.
And so we created the data trust to help manage that ecosystem. And so that gets to the bigger picture of experimentation and the culmination of that culture change for us. Once you've re-envisioned what a party committee does in post-Citizens United and post-McCain-Feingold, and you realize that there's other people that can do things, and that the ecosystem can contribute in information back to the whole, then you then are creating a sentient being of data, and that's where we're trying to get to, is that you have so much information coming in that you can start moving from just purely quantitative to qualitative types of information that you get, because you have, everyone is participating in it. We're not there, we're not fully participatory, we still have some outliers. The Coke world doesn't take part, and there's a few people that don't. But I think that's probably the next level of experimentation, is how do you take that much data and start to get a more qualitative assessment on messaging and things at the doors and what you're learning, as opposed to just purely numbers.
Yeah, that brings me to my next sort of question here. One of my old political mentors was this guy, Mark McKinnon, and he said, campaigns are never won on issues, they're won on values, right? And that has like stuck with me like forever, and even into my own professional startup career and entrepreneurship and things like that. We now, I think, live in a world where sometimes technology is maybe more complicated than we need it to be, right? So, we have our social media accounts, our Facebooks, which, by the way, I've been off social media for about a year, and just to tell you, it's pretty awesome. I'm writing letters. Try it sometime. But how do you keep technology from sort of distracting the campaign from ultimately what matters most, right? The message, right? Because message is how you talk to people about their values, or talk to them, or how are you making sure that they are more harmonious in their relationship, Mike?
Well, bless you. I think, again, what we did was we re-envisioned the party committee as a marketing operation. And a marketing operation still has to sell a product. And our strategic bet was that the Democrats in 2016 would use a marketing operation to sell one product and try to sell another product with it. They'd created it for Barack Obama. They were going to try and sell Hillary Clinton through that same marketing operation. We had to build an agnostic marketing operation that could sell anything. But you still have to have a good product. And the best data in the world is just going to tell you you're losing. It's going to very accurately tell you that you're down and that you're not, your product is losing to your competitor unless you have a good product. And so, what's amazing about the Trump campaign in 2016 is that we had built, by the time that, what we started in 2013 and 2014, and the strategic bet that we made, that we could leapfrog the Democrats because we would build a broader, harder, larger marketing operation that could be agnostic. But it still wouldn't have worked if we didn't have a candidate who drove clicks, drove likes, was at rallies, dominated media, had a movement level following, had an intensity of his followers to utilize that data thing. It just would have been something that was very accurately saying you're losing, right? And I think the other thing that's worth noting about is that the culture change in our party had also affected some of the candidates that were running. So ironically, if one of the other more establishment candidates had won the nomination, they may not have used the RNC system.
Sure.
Because they would have said, we have our own.
We have our own team.
The Trump campaign, and Brad in particular, was able to say, wow, this is amazing, they built it, why don't we use that? Get rid of Cambridge, use this, and this actually works. And then if we plug that on top of the candidate we have, so in the end, that candidate on the top, the product you're selling has to be good, and it has to connect with people. It has to have the right values. It has to fit into a market. There has to be a market for it.
David?
Yeah, I'd say the most important thing is big broadcast communication. People aren't deciding who to vote for on the basis of ads they see or people knocking on their door. And so the big thing for us after 2016 was figuring out how can we actually test and affect what messages work and which messages don't.
It's like engagement versus likes.
Well, it's different.
More.
I mean, right now, the problem with politics, it's something that David talked about earlier, is just that we, in politics, you don't observe your own conversions. And that's very weird relative to other places. Normally, if you're Dollar Shave Club and you show someone an ad and someone clicks on the ad, then you can see the credit card, you can match it up, and you can figure out what ads are good or bad. In politics, the only thing you see is you see likes, you see whether or not a video gets a lot of buzz, you can see how many times something gets retweeted, but the people who are retweeting, people who are liking things are not persuadable voters. And so,
Or they're bots.
yeah. And so, the big thing for us is just trying to give people a scorecard to figure out what's working and what's not working. We tested 200 advertisements in 2018, and something like 25% of them had a negative effect. Not just didn't do anything, but like made people saw the ad and wanted people to, then wanted to vote.
Mike apparently wants those.
Yeah.
I said we would trade.
You trade,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. And people in the office love these ads because people who work in progressive politics couldn't be more different than swing voters. And so that's just been the really big thing for us, is just actually being able to measure and provide guidance on what to talk about and what not to in a rigorous way. And that's very new, more new than people think.
Side pocket question here. Did you guys ever figure out like how much free media Trump earned? Like, did we ever quantify the amount of money equivalent that he earned every time they used?
You mean this afternoon or
Yeah, that's right.
during the 2016?
Yeah,
There's
both.
actually been some studies.
Has
done.
there? Because I'm
It's in the
curious about
billions.
that.
Yeah, it's definitely with a B.
Substantial. Like, I remember one day, like during I think it was 2016, I think pretty much every time I went to CNN.com, it was only Trump. I was like, this can't be good for Democrats, right? What do you think, John? What's
I think that it's been interesting. Talk about the culture and the tie. Nothing makes me sound so old as, well, back when I started doing this. But I think all of us who do data and technology for campaigns, we started off being like, no one would take us seriously. People wouldn't give you $50, nobody would listen to us. And then on the Democratic side, I think in 2016 things swung too far. And it became, oh, if we spend money on the tech, if we build this tool, it's gonna take care of it, right? And what we need to think about is that the technology is a set of tools that need to be used for some end. Right? Immediately post-2016 election, when everyone was looking and yelling at analytics folks, we didn't work on the campaign, so they weren't yelling at me, but my field. It's like you can build the best car in the world, and then someone can drive it into a tree, and it's very hard to blame the car for that, right? And the car is what we all
Blame
do.
the tree.
You blame the tree is in the wrong place, right? The tree got investigated by James Comey in October. You can, it is our job to build a really great car and then hopefully, give people a good map, be there in the back seat saying where to turn, but you've got to use it to do something. And I think that is where, it's really important for candidates going forward. Whenever I'm pitching clients, my first question is, why are you running for this office? And they're like, aren't you going to tell me about your thing? I was like, I need to understand what you want to do with this, right? That I don't know how to build you a model until I know what you want to do with it. And so yeah, I think it's, at the end of the day, politics is really simple. It's about people talking to people about things that matter to them, right? And how to make their lives better. And everything we do should be in service of that, but it can't replace it. And my background is field. I do believe that there's a ton of value in strangers talking to strangers about politics, and technology can help us do that better, but it can't replace it. When one of my passion projects is working on LGBT non-discrimination issues, and the most movement we've ever seen in any experiment we've done is when people go talk about transgender non-discrimination, when trans volunteers are willing to go come out on the front door of someone, say who they are, explain why they should be able to use the bathroom, we see 30% movement that is enduring over years, because that is a very powerful thing to do. And technology helps us figure out which voters are most receptive, where we should go, when we should do it, but it doesn't replace that person talking to a person about something that's deeply personal and important. So yeah, that's my answer.
And how is the RNC thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a whole lot to add beyond what Mike talked about earlier. I mean, ultimately, technology, data, analytics, digital, they are tools. They are tools to use in service of a campaign. They are helpful. I would use the analogy, like I went to Alabama, Roll Tide, but a football analogy. Candidates score touchdowns, staff, data, tech, all of that stuff can maybe kick a field goal. When the race is in the margins, that stuff matters, but ultimately, yes, I would argue the RNC did a great job with data in 2016. I would argue we're going to do a great job with data in 2020. But ultimately in 2016, our data didn't beat the DNC's data. Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
Candidates matter, and you can't get away from that, and you need to use the tools that data, digital tech provide to help advance their campaign.
And how do you, when you're in these primary cycles, how do you really, I mean, because these seem like really great opportunities to really refine the candidate, right? And match the candidate with the audience for the general election. You know, how do you guys think about that? And because the primaries are really quite difficult.
Well, and the audience is very different, right? Like the folks that are swing voter, in our primary, 85% of folks started out as swing voters, but within a group of people who 3% are swing voters in the general election, right? And so all of the messages that we're talking to now are convincing folks that hopefully we don't need to worry that much when we get to past the summer. So I do think a lot of people build up these tools and systems thinking that it's going to give them a huge advantage, and then they're like, oh, in fact, we know a lot about how to talk to college-educated people in Cambridge, which, God bless you all, you are not our target for next fall.
Well, but this is interesting, though, because like if you think about the primary apparatus, right, you know, a lot has changed for the Democratic Party, right? The superdelegates issue, open primaries, Bernie's winning, closed primaries, Hillary's winning, like,
the fact
how is this affecting the game?
Yeah, that
you know,
10 million people who were Republicans 8 years ago, mostly college-educated, mostly female, mostly suburban, are now identifying as Democrats and participating in the primary. We saw a huge surge in the 2018 primaries of people who previously had been Republicans who demographically are quite different than our previous primary voters. And so I think that's going to have an impact. Yeah, it's going to be, you know, in 2018 we saw massive turnout surges across the country, mostly in suburban areas and mostly college-educated women. And so I think, you know, it'll be very interesting to see how campaigns work with that.
There were two big advantages that we as a party mechanically got out of our primary process. One was sitting next to me because we had a staff deficit. Because we had only just begun to change the culture in 13 and 14 to focus on this as a priority, whereas the Democrats were way ahead of us, we simply weren't generating enough experts in this field. And the primaries created that for us. It was a stimulus effect of hiring folks, and that's where we got Ellen from. Yeah. And then the second thing was, and this is really a tribute to what Reince Priebus was able to do as chairman at that time, because we had a strong national party, because we'd rethunk it and made it into the entity that it was, we were able to sell the concept of an ecosystem to all 17 of our candidates. So they all signed a data sharing agreement back with the party. So when all of those likes and door knocks and all that energy that's created was being generated, we were able to bring that all back into the party.
Pretty incredible, you guys were
and utilize that as a foundation for the ecosystem. And so we didn't lose the energy that was taking place amongst the base that was then able to be brought to bear in the general election.
Yeah, because if I recall, like that, you know, people held on to that stuff pretty closely. It's incredible that you were able to get everybody to come together and agree to do that.
It really became a model for how we could operate in the ecosystem because we do have competitors. We are free market capitalists that like to compete, and people are always concerned about having a competitive edge. And so we had to negotiate what was off limits and proprietary, and that they're always going to keep, for instance, all their donor data that they don't want to share because there's a real strong value to that. And what is, look, this was a Smith, not a Jones at this door, and that's going to benefit the whole party up and down. And you want to get, if you plan on winning, you want to get everyone else's information.
Absolutely.
And that allowed the data trust to create a brand, the party and the data trust to create a trusted brand that we now are able to put our payment platform WinRed into and have it succeed under the same trust.
Now we can take both Democratic data and Republican data, we can put it on a blockchain, we can tokenize it, and we can use an ERC 725 smart contract. Okay, we'll talk later. So when I'm looking at the 2016, I mean, I was traveling around and, you know, Trump, you know, announces his nomination, and I was sort of under the impression, I was like, a Republican's going to win. right? Just if you looked at the field and you looked at and said, okay, well, redistricting in 2016, Pennsylvania is probably going to go Republican, right? You kind of look at some of these little pockets around where, Republicans basically had to win Pennsylvania, and if they could turn Pennsylvania, Trump's probably going to win the election, right? And so it made me think a lot more about redistricting, right? I think Michigan and Wisconsin and things like that, those were really kind of unexpected surprises for me. How does the campaign or the sort of party think about those kinds of efforts, right? This concept of gerrymandering that people are always talking about. I know the Obama effort is really focused on that. I know Arnold Schwarzenegger is really focused on open primaries and gerrymandering as an overall topic, right? And we're coming up on a 2020 census, right? And that census is ultimately going to be determining how these districts are, given opportunity to redraw a lot of these districts. So how is it that technology is supporting those kinds of efforts, right? Do we have AI algorithms to predict, human migratory patterns to try to figure that out, or are we, moving in a slightly different direction? David?
Yeah, I'd say that, when people in 2018 were trying to figure out how many resources do I put, into this Secretary of State race or this state ledge race,
Yep.
it was 100% a big consideration of, well, if we don't...
Because it's a state legislature effort, right?
It's a state legislative effort. It varies a lot by state. There are places, people will game out, well, if the state legislature and the governor is split, it will go to the Supreme Court, so we should invest in the Supreme Court races, or there's going to be this Secretary of State in Ohio that for some reason has a lot of power, so we should put a lot of money there. But yeah, there are concerted efforts on both sides. I think historically the Republicans have been much smarter about this and figuring out, we have this big...
Well-timed.
Yeah, no, well, it worked.
Well, and it's going to be, it's going to play out in this upcoming cycle, right? Because, you had this ruling in Pennsylvania where they reverted back to the original districts, and then all of a sudden now you have more Democratic seats in the House, and it's going to play out somehow.
Yeah. And
Which states should we be watching this time?
So in Texas, Democrats need to flip 6 seats in the state House for a majority, and if we had a majority there, we could, courts would probably intervene and draw the Texas maps, and obviously the second largest delegation, hugely gerrymandered, and Democrats would stand, a fair map of Texas would yield a lot more Democratic opportunities. So I think you'll see, even if Texas isn't competitive for the electoral votes, I think you'll see huge investments there in targeted areas around legislative seats. I think you'll see the same thing in North Carolina. There's a Democratic governor in North Carolina, but he has no ability to veto redistricting laws.
Which was one of the key reasons to try to win Florida, right?
Right.
At the state ledge level.
So legislature, the Supreme Court in North Carolina has redrawn their state ledge lines, so then that would give us the chance to, hopefully win a majority. I think you'll see a lot of the, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, where there'll be a lot of that work. But a lot of there's ballot initiatives in a lot of states that have changed the way the rules are drawn. In Michigan, the voters took it out of the hands of the legislature. The legislature is trying to put it back in their own hands. So I think we'll continue to see some ballot measures in 2020 to try to depoliticize the
I know there's a lot of investment going into this topic right now. I've seen it quite a bit more heavily, I think. Yeah. Certainly, I know it's one of, as I mentioned, Schwarzenegger and Obama are both pushing this conceptually as a topic. How do you guys think about operations around this stuff? Because this is outside of the typical candidate cycle. It's kind of a party thing.
I was the DCCC analytics director in 2011, which was the last redistricting cycle. So nobody actually cared about Democrats' opinions in redistricting because we had just gotten our butts kicked. If you've heard of Obamacare, not great timing on our side. So a lot of what we were doing as a party was just trying to interpret what was happening, that if a map came out, we would have, every time a draft came out in California, I had 38 panicked members calling to be like, what's happening, what are we gonna do? Just trying to interpret and understand it. So I think one of the roles for the party is just making sure we have really good data so that as drafts do get released, we can understand what works, what doesn't, what the impacts are gonna be. I think the party can do a lot to democratize the tools. It's not hard. The hard part isn't drawing the map. Like people often, entrepreneurs and AI folks want to come and be like, oh, I can have a computer draw this line. It's like the line drawing we can handle, right? It's the politics that are hard. The map, the geography is easy.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that we need to think about better, and everybody here needs to think, is like, what can we do with analytics and data to try to predict what the impact 10 years from now is going to be?
Yeah.
The Illinois districts that were drawn in 2011. One of the districts that was drawn that was heavily Republican, now elected a Democrat in 2018 because it's a suburban district with a lot of wealthy, college-educated people. And we thought that Obama numbers in 2011 were the best we'd ever do, and Donald Trump is toxic in that place, right? And so a district that was drawn by the Illinois Democrats to be a Republican vote sink is now a safe Democratic seat. And it hasn't been that long. And I think it's easy for us to get overconfident that what the world looks like in 2021 is what the world will look like in 2029.
Yep.
And if there's anything we should have learned this decade, it's that we're idiots and have no idea what's happening.
Yeah, that's interesting. Mike, what do you guys think?
Well, look, I could talk for a long time about redistricting. And, I mean, the history of redistricting is that we were terrible at it, and we finally started getting better in 92, 94, when Republicans started working with the Congressional Black Caucus and utilizing the Voting Rights Act to create majority minority districts. But we still were way, way behind the Democrats, and we finally got our act together because we won an election in 2010. And now the narrative is that Republicans gerrymander and Democrats never did it, and all their lines are fair, and we're the people that create sinkholes. And I could try to tell you a whole class about how that's not true. And
Maryland.
look, gerrymandering is about raw power. And so when you have power, you draw the lines to favor yourself, and you say it's fair. And when you don't have power, you say, I can't believe they drew the lines. They're taking the will of the people away. And we'll see if the Democrats win and they gerrymander the lines for them, it'll suddenly be so super fair. And that's just, there is no ideology in gerrymandering. It is purely raw power. People don't want to talk about that, but that's what happens. And so both parties are going, at the state level, and the courts keep shoving it back to the states because they're allowed to write their own lines, and that's what's going to happen. And so I will say, to the point you're asking about, is that actually redistricting was an earlier, was a pre-runner to a lot of data and analytics and campaigns. It was one of the places in politics where people really did focus on how can you look at geography and demographics and bring them together and create sort of rudimentary computer programs to kind of help with that, going back to the 90s before really the internet was even being utilized. So.
And Ellen, how are you guys thinking about that as you're gonna have to deal with it here pretty soon in Pennsylvania? Like, how are you guys thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, some of it from our perspective, just to emphasize Mike's point, it is purely who controls redistricting in these various states. And so some of it for us looking toward 2020 is making sure we do provide data and resources to state Senate, state House, Secretary of State, up and down the ballots. A lot of these races that really people just don't focus on. People don't know that they're happening. People don't engage in them. And so for us, it's making sure that they have the same data resources that President Trump's campaign has. So really kind of democratizing that. But for us, it's sort of funny because redistricting is obviously you want to build these analytical models projecting how things will move. But it's funny because redistricting is one of this. It's weird because it goes back to a lot of the basics of how we did things before data and analytics. Like, have you, and you probably did at some point, have you ever had to call county clerks and collect precinct data?
Oh gosh.
Well, what's funny is you actually, nowadays you don't use that a ton in most modern campaigns. Redistricting, you do. You gotta have it. You gotta have all the election results up and down the ballot.
I called a county in Ohio once and I asked her to send us the precinct results, and she said, well, the computer with the precinct results not the same as the computer with the emails. And this was 2016.
This is common though.
I had to go in and I brought a jump drive and I taught them how to use it. It was 2016. Yeah.
And so a lot of it for us is just that blocking and tackling of, working with the various groups, where we can, whether it's Data Trust or Fairlines involved in redistricting and making sure all of that data is readily available and ready to go when that all starts.
Just to understand how that partisan stuff affects, if you're going to a county and the person in charge is from the other party, you might get it a little slower when you get that county information.
Yeah, Mississippi does not hurry to get us anything. I can assure you.
And neither,
I gotta tell you, they don't really move fast enough.
Illinois
They just
and
don't move
I
fast.
think it's not personal.
No, it's not. They're just
Not many
not.
Democratic counties either. So, you know.
Well, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about a county clerk in a really long time until just now.
You don't, except every 10 years. You got to make sure you have all the precinct data.
That's right. Well, I know I want to leave a few minutes for questions. We've 7:45 was this wrap up, I believe, right? So I want to leave a little bit of time. But really quickly, I want to throw out some stuff and just rapidly respond to it. Don't think too much about it. A few of them we've already talked about, but we'll just go straight down the line. Quick thought, and then I'm going to throw another one at you. Liquid democracy.
What? I've got nothing to that. Sorry.
I have no idea what that is.
You don't know what that is, really? Wow. Well, so it's this idea that I, as a voting citizen, could proxy my vote to somebody else who I think is an expert, and then they can vote my opinion on a particular issue, all managed digitally.
All on the blockchain.
On the blockchain, exactly.
I mean, politics.
Speaking of blockchain, go.
Politics used to work like that in the 19th century, and it was very effective.
You just let your union boss do it. It was great.
That is,
Blockchain.
And as they were talking about before, have you ever worked with a county clerk office?
blockchain. We figure out a way to raise money from it and fund campaigns. I'm all for it.
The FEC allows you now to accept crypto, right?
Yeah.
So.
I think that's sort of running before we can walk. The election system is run by mostly sweet old ladies who have to hear your name correctly and write it down, and we struggle at that point. So yeah, I think we need to think about any new advances working at a very basic level.
Yeah, I mean, you really just have to think about how elections are run at a local level, which it's volunteer run, and it is kind of an awesome example of democracy. Like these little old ladies, men, women, everyone come out and volunteer to run these elections.
League of Women Voters, man. Right, they generate the voting manual or whatever, the League of Women Voters. Internet voting.
My side would really like it. I don't know, it's sooner we can get it, it would be great.
We can blockchain that.
Internet voting, look, dangerous right now, and I think, but eventually the internet does everything, and so I'm sure it'll happen one day.
Cool.
Yeah, the Putin folks want it, that's for sure. I think we have a lot of security problems to solve first.
Yeah, I mean, we're just not there yet. I mean, you saw the DNC move to disallow online voting for the caucuses. I mean, we're just not there yet.
Awesome. All right. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to open it up for questions now. So somebody was
I'm
going
going
to
to take questions back here. If you guys want to make a line, because I feel like there are going to be a lot of questions, just come over here to me, please. In the meantime, while everybody's gathering, I got a question. First of all, thank you, Republicans, for coming to the People's Republic of Cambridge. We really appreciate it. So I guess while everybody's gathering, my question is actually not about data, but about ethics. As a general rule, the FTC frowns upon marketing products that are based on false premises. So products that are inaccurately advertising themselves. And I'm talking about the current administration. So is there a movement to either self-regulate or to involve the government in some kind of an oversight capacity to make sure that advertising is honest? Because this is advertising, and advertising is, in essence, the manipulations of people's feelings. So if you could talk to that while I pass the microphone on to the next person.
Yeah, I can start on that. There are rules about what outside groups can say. The exception is that candidates are allowed, if they put their face to camera saying, I approve this message, that the First Amendment has been ruled to say they can say anything they want. And I think that's the interpretation of the First Amendment. I don't think there's any likelihood that's going to change. There are rules about what you can say on TV as outside groups. So the Sierra Club can't say something they know to be false but Hillary Clinton you can't control what she says. I do think that right now one of the ethical questions is that the internet platforms are not holding themselves to the same standards as TV stations for outside group spending. I hope that they do. I hope Facebook in particular adopts the same standards that TV stations use on honesty, but there's the First Amendment is going to give us this massive loophole around individual candidates with their money saying whatever the heck they want.
I'll be pretty strong about this. I can't think of a more aberrant idea than some regulatory group limiting the free speech of a candidate, and I can't think of a bigger abrogation of the First Amendment and what it was designed for and what the founders actually wrote it for than that idea. So yes, outside groups are private companies and therefore are subject to libel if they can be sued for saying something that's incorrect. If we're going to create a system where we say candidates are going to have some kind of truth council, and who's on the truth council and who determines that, we have that already. They're called the voters. And I think that one of the dangerous ideas that is growing is that there are many Americans who think that the voters are just too stupid. I mean, how could they not be? Look what they've done. That's what they believe. And so they want to try and do something in an elite way to fix that. And I think that the more that they push for that, the more that those voters get angry and want to reject them for doing it, as opposed to letting them have their own ideas and their own decision making, because candidates in both parties say things that aren't true, in every party. And the voters are the ones that are ultimately responsible, as the framers determined, meant for them to be responsible citizens to go and make a decision on their own without someone deciding it for them. And I say this as someone who works in the media. I believe that I fear for the media. I fear for the situation that they are in, because their approval rating and their trust amongst the people is going like this, because they set themselves out to be what you're talking about, which is someone who could determine, help people understand what the truth is, and they're botching it so poorly that people just don't even trust them anymore. So I think it's an incredibly dangerous idea.
You know, it's interesting. I actually saw a study by Harvard IOP that said that people trust the military more than they trust the media now.
I come from a very low-tech part of the country, state of Maine. They have, in spite of their down-home ways, they've gone with ranked choice voting. And I wondered if you would talk about what challenges that raises to technology.
I'll lean in. I actually helped work on the campaign that passed ranked choice voting, so it's a thing that I'm really passionate about, and I would love to see more folks adopt the Maine model. I think the first problem on technology is that it does require a lot more training, a lot more, the voting machines, the tabulation are different, but it's not really a tech problem, it's a training problem. It's how you get the very nice volunteers that make the system work to understand what all the rules are, but also how can we make it go faster? That it took, we all were pretty sure that Janet Mills won the Democratic primary in 2018, but it took a week and a half before we could actually say for sure that had happened, because everything had to drive to Augusta, they had to retabulate over and over again. Lots of countries that use ranked choice voting can make it go faster. Ireland does a transferable vote, which they can do in about a day. So I think, hopefully more jurisdictions. Right now it's Maine, Minneapolis, and Oakland, and as more jurisdictions adopt it, hopefully some entrepreneurs invest in tools for the tabulation of the ballots so that it goes faster in a way that's still open and accountable and auditable. Yeah, I love ranked choice voting.
Me too. Hi, I'm a state representative here in Massachusetts, and we're really far behind in both parties on technology-wise. We just had a session the other day about why it's important to have a website. We have a little ways to go, but I'm really fascinated by this. I'm an MIT alum. So my question is, you talk about tools, and I know at least in Massachusetts, the Republican Party uses Salesforce, and the vast majority of the Democratic Party uses NGP Van, Vote Builder. When you're talking about tools, are they add-ons to those? Are you downloading the existing data from there on a regular basis? Is it some sort of separate situation, or is it just the consulting that is the tool that you're talking about in terms of the analytics associated with that?
Yeah, I'll take that one. One of my hobby horses is like getting all of the tools that the RNC has and that the Republican Party has in the hands of. I assume you're on the Democratic side. It's Massachusetts, but you know, statistically speaking, most
90%
likely.
odds, yeah.
But you know, it's a whole big swath of things, and I can only speak to the Republican side. But you know, we have tools from Massachusetts on the Republican side. You have GOP Data Center, which allows you to pull lists of voters, analyze your voter lists. We have a tool called the RNC Data Hub, which integrates all of the different tools that we have available for candidates and campaigns, from data visualization tools to list pulling tools to call tools to walk tools to texting tools and so on. And that's all a lot. And that's one of the reasons people are so important. Like, one of the things that I say to campaigns, it's not really about the tools. Tools are important. You want good tools. You want tools that crash, that don't break. But what you really need at this point is technology has gotten so complicated and the tools and data we have available is so vast. You want people who do this day in and day out to sit and work with you. So, you know, at the RNC, when I started in the summer of 2017, the data team was a little over 20 people. By the end of this cycle, we'll be over 80 at least. And most of that investment is focused on hiring external support. We call them external support, but basically a team of people who just fly around the country and work with candidates like yourself on how to use these tools and how to stand up, you know, whether it's your scripts for knocking on doors in your neighborhood, or how to make phone calls, or, you know, working with whatever digital vendor is doing your emails to integrate all of your data. And so a lot of it, I think the focus, and we were actually talking about this a little bit before the panel started, a lot of the focus has turned from tools to people, because we finally built this ecosystem of data professionals who can work with campaigns day in and day out to help them leverage the, like, I think we counted, it's like 300 gazillion terabytes or something. I'm not even saying that correctly. But.
Yeah, and I'll add just one more thing, because I think this like illustrates something really interesting about state-led stuff. You know, we worked with, my firm worked with the DLCC. We did it in 2016, 2018, we're doing it again, where, you know, we have forecasts, polling and forecasts in every single state legislative district in the country. We have issue-specific models on who to talk to across 100 different issues, and it was available for free for literally every single Democratic state legislative candidate in the country. And the biggest thing is that I've never met a state legislator who knew it existed outside of like 3 or 4 states, because there's like 3,000 state legislatures and state legislators, and they don't even, you know, there's like an intricate, complex politics between the caucus directors and the state parties and all this other stuff. You should talk to your caucus director, though. You have a bunch of stuff you can probably get for free.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you guys for coming here to speak today. My name is Nick. I worked on a political campaign last summer, and this debate came up every once in a while, so I'm curious for your takes. In an increasingly polarized America, I sometimes feel like, from a resource standpoint, it might be better to turn out your base than to focus on persuasion tactics. I'm curious if you see campaigns trending that way, and if either persuasion methods are, you know, what you were talking about, having face-to-face conversations, are either becoming more important or less important?
Yeah, I'll start on that. I think that the reality is that both are important, that they're two wings of a bird, you need them both. It is, when you persuade a voter, you are adding one to your pile and taking one away from your opponent's pile. When you turn somebody out, you're not impacting the other. So there is a ton of power to that. It is, you know, when we look at the 2018 election results for Democrats, probably about 90% of the difference between 14 and 18 was not different people voting, but who people were voting for changed. And I think it's very easy to, you know, when you live in a bubble in a polarized world, to be like, well, my Republican uncle isn't going to vote for a Democrat, so therefore no Republicans vote for a Democrat. But there's a ton of persuasion we see happening everywhere, and it's very easy to understand. You know, Donald Trump says that he could shoot somebody and not lose any supporters, but like almost everything he says, that isn't true. He's lost a lot of supporters, and he lost millions of them. And they voted for Democrats in 2018. A lot of them are going to vote for Democrats in 2020. There's a ton. We are in a polarized world. I don't think it's as polarized as we necessarily think. And part of the problem is the tools we have to measure polarization are uniquely repellent to the very voters we're talking about, right? We measure polarization by doing 25-minute telephone surveys. The only person who's going to take a 25-minute telephone survey are people like us who are dumb enough to spend a nice night in Cambridge in this room, right? We like to talk about this, so we want to talk about it. If you're the kind of non-polarized voter who's not deeply engaged in this, we're going to call you up and be like, hey, and they're, sorry, I got other things to do. So it is polarized. I don't know that it's as much. I think, turnout's going to be incredibly high in 2020. Democrats shouldn't take any of that for granted, but there are a lot of voters out there. About 15% of the country voted for Donald Trump in 2016 thinking he would be a bad president, right? They didn't like him, they didn't like Hillary Moore, they voted for him. Those folks are huge persuasion targets that we cannot forget about, and I think we need to stay really focused on that while also fully investing in the turnout operations.
I have might be surprised, a slightly different take on that. But I'll tie it back into the Coke thing. So I used to work for Newt Gingrich, and he's from the suburbs of Atlanta. And we did a meeting with the CEO of Coke in the mid-90s, Robert Goizueta, I believe his name was. And their annual report that year was, the Coke little wave. It was a wave made into an infinity sign, and that's all it was on the investor report. And Coke had reached a point where the sort of zeitgeist around it on Wall Street and everywhere else was that it was saturated. Like, how can you possibly grow? Everyone in the world is drinking Coke. There's Coke in like 162 countries around the world. And the opening page from him, his comments were something, I don't remember the exact numbers, but something like the average human consumes, 60 ounces of liquid a day, and on average, only 4 of them are Coke if you put it around the world. And so his point was, there's always room to grow. There's always room to grow. So tying it back to a marketing thing with Coca-Cola, look, I think that there's a human behavior of persuasion, and which is a more difficult human behavior? Is it to switch sides, or is it to go from non-voting to voting? And actually, one of the things that we learned from the Obama campaign, you hear this over and over again, we studied them because they were so good, especially their data team in particular, in finding non-voters that modeled like their voters and getting them to show up. And so you're right, you do have to do both, but you shouldn't always treat them equally, because which human behavior is easier to carry out is different in different places amongst different people. In some places, it is easier to find someone who is a non-voter who models like your voters and get them to show up. That's an easier thing to do. And so you shouldn't ever treat it monolithically.
Yeah. And I would add on to that, it also is going to depend on the candidate. I know this is Massachusetts, so a lot of you don't like the president, but one of the things I would say is he has done a phenomenal job of engaging voters who do not typically engage. If you look at, to his example about the 25-minute survey, you wouldn't think a voter who's never voted before would wait in line for 8 hours to get into a Donald Trump rally, but they do. On average, they're over 10% of the registrations for a Donald Trump rally, and that's insane. And so we have a candidate.
It is pretty insane.
It's just nuts. I guarantee, and I don't know this for fact, they weren't tracking it at the time, but if you look back at Mitt Romney's rally attendees, it would not look like that. But you also have to pay attention to what kind of candidate you have. And obviously, we're going to want to persuade voters. I think there are a lot of voters who aren't going to like some of the things that the Democrats are saying to have to get through the primary, banning straws and burgers. I like hamburgers. I bet a lot of voters in Iowa like hamburgers. But when you have a candidate like Donald Trump that is so able to engage these voters who don't usually vote, sometimes you're going to get more that way. Not that we don't want to also persuade voters, but you have to pay attention to what kind of candidate you have. And if these voters are going to turn out to this rally without us even prompting them, they sign up, they go, they are so engaged and so interested. Maybe it's better to focus on converting those folks in addition to the persuasion. But you do have to pay attention to that.
By the way, while they're transitioning, I actually think I heard Coke is in more jurisdictions than the United Nations. I think that's a true fact.
All right, so there's a lot of concern this year about foreign nation-state interference in our elections, both in favor of the Republican Party and in favor of the Democratic Party. Narrowing to just digital media, what are campaigns thinking about in monitoring this or pushing back against it?
I'll start. I'll actually, obviously, it's a very cool and sexy problem, and so I think a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about it, probably more time than from the perspective of campaigns. There's all sorts of legal and moral concerns, but the reality is that when people talk about the Russians buying a certain number of ads in Wisconsin, the volume, it would be really interesting if foreign governments decided that they were going to spend 7% of GDP to try to influence elections. But in reality, the number of page impressions for these things are always very small. I think what's much more interesting is the extent to which foreign groups are trying to manipulate how people talk about things. There's a lot of evidence that a lot of Twitter trolls that were interfering in the Democratic primary and causing a lot of chaos or getting a lot of journalists to really hate different candidates. That's a really effective thing. There are definitely groups that are sprouting around trying to look at it, but I think it's probably not something that campaigns specifically are too worried about, just because of the stuff he talked about different groups trying to care about different things.
Yeah, the way that the Russians interfered in 2016 wasn't the social media ads, it was stealing the emails and getting the media to talk about that for the last month, right? That the day of the Access Hollywood tape is when the WikiLeaks came out a couple hours later to change the subject and move on. And I think that had an impact. But to David's point, the Facebook ads I don't think did, as much as we want to believe that campaign work is super important. So yeah, I think one of the struggles that people have is that battling disinformation often ends up simply repeating the disinformation and emphasizing it more to folks. That they're very hard, it's hard to find a good model outside of politics that you can be like, oh, this is the way we should do it, because there's backlash to all of it. So yeah, I think it's an incredibly hard problem that there's not a good solution to, but I think folks need to keep their eye on, it's more trying to influence the way the national conversation is going and less that your crazy grandma got a weird email forward from Belarus.
Yeah, and I think and I agree with what they're saying about the scale of what was done on social media. If you read the Mueller report on this, the number of ads versus what Brad's team were doing every hour out of San Antonio, it's not even. So where that would be more relevant is moving down the scale of an office from president. That number in a smaller office where you only have 10,000 voters might have made, but they don't. No one cares about that. So those campaigns aren't, even congressional campaigns aren't really worried about it. The ones that have to worry about it are the presidential campaigns.
Yeah, my name's Nicholas Bolt. I'm a student at Sloan. I think it's very interesting. We mentioned words like engagement, and at the same time, I think a lot of people in the country experience the election through a very passive lens because you're being targeted with digital ads, or you're watching it on TV, or you're reading it in the news. And I think it kind of changes the psychographic effect that in some ways you're alienated from the overall process of the election. And I'm just wondering, with all these tools that you've built, or with all this apparatus you have, with all this understanding, how are you kind of looking at that side of it? Because I think a lot of people understand, well, I could write a check, or I could show up at a rally and listen to somebody, or I could watch a speech, or I could read. But these are sort of passive consumption, and really at the end of the day, it's just, oh, please show up and vote. Yet at the same time, I think people are voting because of values and because they care about the country and about, creating things in their community. And I'm just noticing this disconnect. And I'm not sure it's your role to do this, but have you kind of thought about how this could actually help the ultimate mission and sort of these lasting committees that have to think 10 years down the road, have to think longer term, and keep reaching these same people? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take part of that. One of the things that the Growth and Opportunity Report, and I'm sure Mike can add more on this, but one of the things that came out of it is we have to build a permanent organizing infrastructure in these communities. And when I say that, I don't mean, yeah, let's pay a bunch of, the old model was, let's hire a bunch of people, ship them in from out of state for the last 6 weeks of the election, tell them all to go knock on some doors, yell at them when they don't meet their goals, and that didn't work. We lost in 2012. The Obama campaign, I have to give them credit here, developed an organizing infrastructure, these permanent, it wasn't really permanent for them, but our goal is to develop a permanent organizing infrastructure, and that's volunteers. Like we have, through the RNC, we have something called the Trump Victory Leadership Initiative. It is literally, it's a 6-week training program for voters who want to engage in their communities, who want to reach out to their neighbors, who want to advocate for their, their issues, and teaching them how to do that, how to organize their communities. And then once they finish that, they have the opportunity to become what we call neighborhood team leaders, where it's their job to organize within their community, to do one-on-ones, to chat with their neighbors, to really be there. And one of the things that we found, in a state like Florida, where we've had a permanent on-the-ground infrastructure since 2015, it's the same people. They're continuing on. They're continuing to be that organizer in their communities, and they're volunteers. They're doing this on a volunteer basis because they care about the direction of the country. And so it's our job to sort of provide an infrastructure around them, to provide them the resources that they need. But I mean, it is these volunteers organizing their communities that makes the difference, not up and down the ballot, not just at the presidential level.
And just something I'd add there is, I think a really big problem, we've had with campaigns is that if you're someone who cares a lot, you go, you hear someone, you're inspired, you go through, and the only thing we ask you to do is either we ask you for money or we ask you to knock on the door of total strangers. And I think some of the most exciting work that's happening in politics is just us moving away from this strangers talking to strangers paradigm, which we know from experiments doesn't actually work very well. One of the things we worked on, we piloted in 2016 and then gave it to a nonprofit was, we worked on an app called Vote With Me that took your phone contacts, connected you with GOTV targets who, friends of yours who might not vote, and 230,000 people use it. We know from experiments, people talking to people they know is a lot more effective than this kind of old hub and spoke model that people kind of fell into in the last 20 years. Mm-hmm. And if you look at how campaigns used to work, in the 40s or 50s or 20s, even if it was a little less savory, it was all based around people talking to people in their neighborhood and talking to their friends, and it worked really well. We've kind of moved away from that.
Yeah, I think one of the things we struggle with is the time horizon question, right? That if you were, with all love and respect to my old friends at the DCCC, if you were to build a digital fundraising program that was thinking about 10 years, it would look very different, right? Like they are burning these lists and they're making people, they raise a lot of money, but every 2 years they have completely turned over the list 100% because it's not sustainable. But it works for the short term because in all of our campaigns, the world ends the day after the election. And if I worked for a congressional candidate in Oklahoma this last cycle, and we beat the Republican, and he had $300,000 in the bank, and he's an idiot, right? And he probably thought he was building for the long run, and we were like, yeah, we snuck right in there at the end and took it. And it's very hard to balance those needs, right? That you want to think in a 10-year horizon, but if you lose in November, you're done. And I think from a startup perspective, it's an interesting it's one place that we're so different that we can't really think in a 10-year horizon. We have to think in these immediate 2-year chunks. And then we're like, wow, I really wish somebody else would do that. And I think one of the things that, some of the outside groups, some of the, there are people who can break out of that cycle and figuring out how we can plug those in and build a more sustainable infrastructure, I think is one of our challenges.
Yeah, it's a really, really important question. I'm sorry,
go for it.
I probably run out of time, but I think the biggest fear that I had when I finally realized what I was facing in 13 and 14 at the RNC, as we were getting our brains beaten out by the Democrats on data, was that not only did we have to catch up to them, but I really actually felt like the future of political parties was at stake. And that sounds like hyperbole, But political parties are under attack. Very few people will do what I'm doing right now, which is defend parties and the relevancy of parties and why they matter. When we rate other emerging democracies, and we have nonprofits that rate them, we rate them on their judiciary, we rate them on their free press, we rate them on their strength of their political parties. Countries like Ukraine have like 32 political parties, right? So none of them have any power, and they're all based around a person. And we have had strong parties, and yet what happens is our politicians use them to get elected and then turn around and just diss them and say, I don't like the party. And then even the members of the party are like, I agree with you, they're terrible. As opposed to, and that's dangerous, because we are in an era of populism where we're also attacking all institutions, church, academia, military, corporate, banking, everything. And so parties are seen as institutions that need to be attacked, but it's dangerous. And so data for us was like one of the last things that a party had that was super relevant, that could do what you're talking about, which is just, if you have a data infrastructure and an ecosystem that can live on, then it continues to make the party relevant to the candidates, other than you create the nominating process for president and you help me get my name on the ballot, and other than that, we're gonna have a corporation do everything else on the outside. And so the threat that we had was, and we sit in the shadow of a fabulous institute from the Koch organization with cancer research. They've done tremendous work on a number of levels. But what they had done is they had built an organization that was a shadow party data organization to take over where we had floundered as a party. They had filled the vacuum. When we started to make ourselves better, they didn't just say, oh, the party's back, we'll see you later. We'll work with you. They started competing with us. And I thought that was incredibly dangerous. I still think it's dangerous. I think if you looked at what a company like that stands for, I probably agree with 80% of their 90% of their agenda, laissez-faire government, they're for prison reform, things I agree with. But they're not a party. Companies are not parties. Private investors are not parties. Parties are accountable. Parties elect people through the counties all the way up to the national level. I think the Democrats are actually in the same crisis right now, whether some people in the Democratic Party may not realize this. President Obama was faced with the same question. Should we invest into the party and make it strong, or should we have outside people do it? He said outside. The DNC has never recovered. To this day, it is a borderline bankrupt national party. They really need to win the presidential election and then have a president who believes in funding them for them to get back. And so one of the ways that we were actually able to leapfrog them, it should never have happened because we were out of office. When you have the president, you have resources. We were able to leapfrog them out of office because of that decision that was made. So that's a really long, but it's a super, super important topic and answer that isn't talked about very much. The data infrastructure and the marketing apparatus of a party is what a party is. It's what makes it relevant, and it is super important for American democracy. And as much as I'm a huge partisan and sort of have enjoyed obviously beating the DNC in fundraising and beating them in data, I'm actually worried for the DNC because of what it would mean for our democracy if you start to have parties just completely crumble away.
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
I agree with everything you said.
Sorry. Hi, everyone. My name is Hillary, spelled with one L. And first of all, it's so wonderful to see the four of you sitting so close together at 1.5 tables. So thank you, first of all, for being present. It's truly a wonder and a beautiful thing to see. I also sit here with a bit of flushed cheeks because blockchain was mentioned earlier, and I actually happen to work with a company that is running mobile voting pilots, the first in the nation, with overseas citizens. West Virginia was the first to pilot in the midterms last year, and all of the elections have a full paper auditable trail that we're running public-facing citizen audits with. So if any of you are curious to learn more, I'm happy to share more. But what I really want to ask is, I was really blown away by the 10 billion number that was quoted. And I was also really struck by Ellen's comment that at the end of the day, the goal is for the frontliner, what's the football player called, who runs the ball across the line?
Fullback.
Thank you. The quarterback to score touchdown. I'm not a football guru. At the end of the day, it's candidates winning. And at the end of the day, for a candidate to win, it's getting voters to turn out. And I know we've talked about this in every which way tonight, but I'm curious, what tool does each of you not have? What one tool would you hope to have if you had a magic wand to help you in getting voters to turn out?
A candidate.
Yeah, I mean, a Democratic candidate actually would, you know, for contrast.
Yeah, I mean, look, we have it. We have what we need.
Yeah.
You have to have a product. You can have all of it's what we said before. You can have all this infrastructure. If you don't have a product that has a market that actually can compete in that market and have an audience that wants to get a hold of it, none of this is going to matter. That's what you have to have.
I mean, I'd just say, you know, we had the highest turnout midterm in 2018 that's ever happened. For better or for worse, everybody cares an enormous amount about politics, and that just has to continue in order for turnout to be high.
Yeah, I think the 10 billion number is an interesting one because like 9 billion of it is going to be wasted. We just don't know which 9 yet. But a lot of what it is offsetting, right? That and the reason we both answer a candidate is because we do need that for each other. That, you know, TV ads don't work if both sides are on TV, but they work great if only one side is on TV. And so we need to be there because they're going to be, and we have to cancel it out. And I think, you know, we need that level of just someone to be able to build the campaign around.
Yeah, I mean, for us, to Mike's point, we have what we need. The only thing we're waiting on is which of the 28 Democratic candidates are going to come out of their primary. And for us, I mean, there will be a lot of contrasts to draw there, a lot of positive contrasts. You know, it's one thing to run against nothing. It's another to run against a candidate who has had to take some very extreme positions to get out of a Democratic primary.
All right. Thank you guys very much. Just to close it off, because I failed to mention this before, and we talked a lot about fundraising. We are here at the Enterprise Forum actually a nonprofit, and so I do want to thank our annual sponsors who sponsored this event and sponsor us throughout the year. That's Witham, Caldwell IP, Chen PR, Hamilton Brook Smith Reynolds, Morse, and Wolf Greenfield. I also want to thank Keegan, who's putting his coat on right now, for helping us put this together along with Mark. So thank you all very much. And thank you guys very much. We're going to be going upstairs to the 4th floor for some networking. So the 4th floor is a little hard to find. If you sort of follow that yellow wall, there's elevators going up to the 4th floor. We're going to the R&D pub. I'll ask that you guys don't all come down and swarm everyone down here, but keep the questions to upstairs if you can. Thank you all for coming.